In recent weeks, official Canada has rediscovered South Africa. Prime Minister Trudeau has ticked off the British government for even thinking of selling arms to the white supremacist government of South Africa. Meanwhile, Canadian trade with South Africa is growing. Last week, 19 Ontario manufacturers were making a sales pitch in Johannesburg, subsidized by the Ontario government to the tune of $30,000. Among those who feel that this kind of expedition is lending aid and comfort to the government of South Africa is editorial writer Hugh Windsor. In our weekend studio, he challenged James Graham of the Ontario Department of Trade and Development. Lloyd Robertson was with them.
Mr. Graham, what's the attitude of the government of Ontario toward trading with South Africa?
My department, the Department of Trade and Development, headed by the Honorable Stanley J. Randall, have a practical viewpoint or outlook as far as business opportunities are concerned for the manufacturers and businessmen in Ontario. We say where business can be gained for Ontario manufacturers, where it's practical to pursue this in the structure of Canadian trade policy, we do so.
How does that meet your view, Mr. Windsor?
I would say, Mr. Graham, what you're saying is that if there's a buck to be made, Ontario is going to make it.
Precisely.
And you don't care how you do it.
No, we have some ethical and moral responsibility. I don't particularly like that statement that if there's a buck to be made, we'll get it regardless. We are reasonable traders and aggressive people.
Yes, but the Canadian government says that the South African government is a very bad government. It oppresses its people. It has voted for all kinds of resolutions at the United Nations and has written to the British government saying, don't send arms to South Africa. And then the next day, literally at the same time as Mr. Trudeau's letter is going to the British government raising static, the Ontario government is sending along a group of 19 people to make a buck. And of course, to make bucks for South Africa.
I think the Canadian government has a voice and a role to play in international affairs that passes along some comment and viewpoint with regard to the political considerations in the trading countries around the world. But to say that the Canadian government is not interested or is condemning the South Africans on the basis of doing normal business with them is quite wrong. The Canadian government and the Canadian business community did some $67 million worth of business with South Africa in the most recent figures published, 1969. The situation in South Africa for the businessman is most opportune.
Yeah, but isn't that the reason that it is most opportune is that because of a very oppressive and racially oriented system, we do have a cheap labor force. We do have very much stability in the marketplace because Africans aren't allowed to have unions. They aren't allowed to protest. They have very limited rights. They must live by their contract or they can be put in jail. Now, if a Canadian, or in this case an Ontario investor, says, yes, I want to take advantage of these stable conditions, cheap labor, abundant resources, all of those things which go together to make it a very profitable situation, he's saying, yes, I am prepared to do that regardless of what that implies. Don't you see that the Ontario government, by sending a trade mission there and actively pursuing economic relations with Southern Africa, is actually doing more to counteract this enlightened international political policy that you say we're responsible for? Because the South Africans are going to be far more interested in having your trade mission come there than they are in any resolution that ever passed at the United Nations. There's been so many resolutions at the United Nations that they don't pay any attention anymore. But boy, they need new businessmen coming. They need new technology and they need new investment. And so you're doing more, even though you claim to be not in the political sphere, than the federal government can possibly do at the United Nations.
If one cannot, in my view, rationalize the problems of the world and reach down to every manufacturer and to every entrepreneur and say to him that, you know, you're quite wrong in selling to the Soviet Union or Cuba, or there's a standard of recognition. The Canadian government deals with the Union of South Africa and sells them all sorts of materials, and there's this exchange. So we can't ask the small businessman in a community in Ontario to disregard South Africa because he's playing a vital part in the role against oppression wherever it exists.
In Ottawa, Weekend sought a firm and unequivocal statement on the federal government's position. We were told that the government doesn't encourage anybody to do business with South Africa. On the other hand, it doesn't discourage them.